My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to another edition of How to Disaster. Today, I'm really pleased to bring to you another grassroots organization, much like ours, that started in the midst of a disaster. We started in the middle of wildfire, and this organization started in the middle of a wind and rain event, probably the most significant of this century, which was Hurricane Maria. My guests today are Mark Martin Bras, who is the government liaison and co-founder of Viequeslove, and Kelly Thompson, who is now the executive director. I asked them here today, part of the How to Disaster, so they could tell you their story of mobilizing an entire community to help an island survive an unprecedented wind and rain event on an island 7 miles off another island, Puerto Rico. For over the past 3 years, they have managed to not only serve their community, but act as a hub of recovery and rebuilding. And I just think they have a lot of great advice and ideas that can help other communities, whether or not you're an island. Don't have to be wind and rain. You can be wildfire, any other type of disaster. But one of the things I really love about their story is that they have really engaged the government in advocacy. They have made sure they were culturally appropriate, and they've made sure that they served bilingually, and they served the needs that were right in front of them. One of my favorite stories is about their failures in communication. And it's not so much that failures in communication are a good thing, but what they learned from it was to train, for example, 48 people on their island in how to use a ham radio, and how much of their successes actually came from looking at the problem in front of them and meeting the community exactly where they're at. I think that's a really important part of disaster, is we can't force our systems on to something else and be totally successful. You can bring tools, you can adapt tools, but the biggest successes come from seeing the problem or the challenge in front of you, and then using your creativity in order to solve those problems in ways that are relevant and effective. So I'm so excited to have them with us today, and thank you for joining us. I want to welcome my two guests today. I have Mark Martin Bras, who is the government liaison and community organizer for Viequeslove, which I'm probably totally mangling the name, and I apologize about that, and also Kelly Thompson. And Kelly Thompson is the executive director. And as I said in the intro, I love their organization because it's very grassroots, it's very relevant for the community that they serve. And I also think they have really great lessons that you can take back into your own community and adapt. And so welcome to both of you. And I'm hoping that we can start off by actually you telling us a little bit about yourselves, including what did you do before Hurricane Maria in 2017? And Mark, why don't I start with you? Go ahead.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us and for doing this. I think it's very important to have this type of conservation in this type of format so that we can talk to each other about things we know and lessons learned. I actually work in marine biology, and during the days swam and worked with turtles, fish, students, created an environmental education program named MANTA. And then during the night, I work in a bioluminescent bay where we sample and take water quality measurements of the brightest bioluminescent bay in the world, where anything in the water that moves glows an eerie blue light. So that's what I did before Maria.
That is amazing. And when I saw that in your bio, I was like, oh, you know, it's really going to be rough, but I'm just going to have to go there to check that out too.
Yeah.
The pandemic is over. It's very impressive. And Kelly, can you talk to us about, and Mark, by the way, has lived in Vieques already for 20 years. And so Kelly, can you talk to us about your history in the island and what did you do before Hurricane Maria?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having us on, Jennifer. Before Maria, I was a graphic designer, photographer, and I published a magazine here on the island that was meant to connect the visitor to the island. If you were having a lobster dinner at a restaurant, you got to know through my articles, you got to know the fishermen that caught that lobster for you. So it was really a connecting magazine. That's what I did. And Mark and I have known each other ever since. I think we've both been here for 16 to 18 years. I've lost track, but we've been friends ever since.
200 years.
It feels like that sometimes.
So one of the things that we were talking about just before we started recording was take us back to, it is September of 2017, and correct me if any of my facts are wrong, and Hurricane Maria has hit. And Kelly, take us to where you are, and then Mark, take us to where you are.
Okay, well, one missing part of that puzzle was Hurricane Irma hit before Maria. So the island was completely without power even before Maria. I left the island to work on the magazine. I needed power and internet, so I went to the States with a round trip ticket for 5 days, and then realized power was not to be returned for some time. So as I was watching it and figuring out when to come home, we see Maria forming off the coast of Africa. And that's when we began to get a little bit nervous about what was going to happen to the island. So that evening, actually, my partner was still here on the island. My daughter and I were in the States. That evening, I set up a GoFundMe, hoping to raise $1,000 to $10,000 to maybe send down a satellite phone or something. Because there were really not any other groups that were off the island and accessible with power to put the word out that they needed help. I think that's why the Viequeslove GoFundMe grew and grew, and through the magazine connections with every person who had ever visited Vieques, looking online to see how they could help. We had people from 1974 who came on their honeymoon here and have never returned, but felt such a connection to the island that they gave $500. And the GoFundMe just grew exponentially. In 5 days, we had over $500,000, and it was just an incredible show of love for Vieques.
It's amazing how useful it is if people have visited an area and then they experience a disaster. There's a direct correlation often to the impulse to, or the incentive to donate. And so that's just always one of those components that we want to keep in mind with how to fund a disaster. Mark, what were you doing at this time? What was going on for you?
Well, I was in Vieques, and so we got Maria. Maria was a monster, and we're a small island. It's about 21 miles long, about 4.5 miles wide, facing the Caribbean Sea, and really went right through us and shocked everybody. It was like suddenly the time stopped. People were on the streets. There was a certain shock, a psychological shock to people, even people in government. You never could tell who was going to be able to work. So some of us formed small groups and went clearing roads, and we went taking people out of houses that were destroyed and trying to get access to water, trying to talk to the government and unite and try to figure out what we were going to do, because basically it collapsed. The local government collapsed. The emergency management could not handle everything. The mayor himself was not able to coordinate well. So we started coordinating, and we were on the field. And as I was there with a chainsaw moving things and a truck, suddenly this guy pulls over and gives me a satellite phone. And I'm like, this is very eerie, okay. And I pick it up and it's Kelly. Now, I know Kelly from the Vieques Insider, an incredible graphic designer and stuff. And I'm like, Kelly, we're busy here, foolish me. And so we're busy here, we're doing this thing, and we're taking care of it hands-on. And we need a lot of things. She's like, wait, stop talking. I'm like, no, we got to do this. We got to get to this. And she's like, stop talking. I raised $600,000 for helping Vieques. And so I stopped talking. And I dropped the chainsaw, I turned it off first. And then I went straight to the government and was like, wait, things changed. Because one of the things that happened in Maria here was the isolation of being on an island and the fact that we did not get government support right away as we were thinking we were. We remembered Hugo, we remember things. You saw this massive movement of people around the island here and in the main island. They were not here. So as the days went on,
do let our watchers and our listeners know, the geography of the island. You're an island off an island.
Correct, and we've been called a colony of a colony too. Basically, we are Puerto Rico is 100 and something miles by 35 miles. Obviously, in the Caribbean Sea there, West Indies, and then about 6-7 miles off the coast, as far as a crows fly, you got Vieques, a very thin island. You may know Vieques from the military bombing and the civil disobedience that went on to stop that bombing. But an island that's connected by ferry and in a very inadequate system, and by small little planes that hold like 7 or 9 people. And those things both stopped after Maria. No communication, no supplies, nobody coming. And so we were left in this hopelessness and had to pull together the fact that suddenly at one point we were like, well, at least we got money and we're gonna start doing whatever we can. And so Kelly came up with this great idea and she said, well, if they won't come, we'll send somebody. And she did.
Kelly,
we sent someone and 12 satellite phones.
But how did you choose? So one of the things that happens for those of us who have experienced, huge disasters, and then people from the outside will look at it, and until you actually experience it, it's all theory, But then, and so that's why, how did you choose that person? Where did you buy those satellite phones? How did you make the decision to prioritize the satellite phones? And why was that so important, especially for an island?
Well, it's really interesting about the group that coalesced around this initiative. We knew Mark and we knew what he would be doing on the island. We knew absolutely he was the first person we needed to reach with the satellite phone. Because no matter how many experts you have from off the island, without that local knowledge and that cultural sensibility and knowing your neighbors, it will all fail. So we knew we needed to get a hold of certain people, Mark and my friend Angie Adams. They were both organizing with a great number of other people on the island that were doing so much. But in the States, I also had groups of people approaching me who had, again, been to the island, loved the island, had lived on the island, and were offering their help. None of us were disaster experts or had ever worked in the disaster field before. But knowing that we had local knowledge and those connections to people we knew we had to get satellite phones to them. There was no way to communicate with anyone or to know if anyone was safe. So we knew immediately the groups we had to get the satellite phones to so that we would have that communication, but that they would also have the communication on the ground. Mark delivered the satellite phones to the police, the ambulance, the hospital, the mayor, all of the connecting agencies that needed that communication. And then we had 3 satellite phone calls a day, one at midnight, to find out what was needed on a daily basis.
And by the way, I think a little bit of what you're asking, Jennifer, is part of what this whole initiative and what you're doing is all about. How do we learn from the chaos that it was to build capacity to make it easier? Because you're not always going to have that kind of money and you're not going to be able to pull those kind of triggers. I mean, Kelly hired a private jet, put a person with satellite phones and money and resources and cancer medicine and things like that and send it over. Not everybody can do that. So we have to learn how those experiences taught us how to build capacity. And the prioritizing is a big key factor that you mentioned. Obviously, life or death is the first priority. You know, like if that person's gonna die, throw the book at it, you know, and throw the money at it, because you can't replace that as opposed to a building or some of the other structure. And that's what we were dealing with at first. How do we stop that from happening?
So in the immediate, while the disaster has, you know, in our case, our disasters go on for like 3 weeks. We'll have a wildfire in a wind and rain event. You have it, and then the aftermath is like a bomb hit. With climate change, these disasters are just bigger and larger and more stunning. And one of the things I really love about your story, besides so many things, is the role of the emergent leader. Like, you don't have to have a master's in public policy. You don't have to have disaster experience. What you have to have is relationships, and you have to actually love the place you're serving and put it as the highest priority. We want to encourage emergent leadership in every single disaster, ethical emergent leadership. But so often what people do in a disaster is they look towards the government entirely, and they're like, well, aren't they coming? I mean, where's the cavalry? And we are here to let every disaster affected community know that the cavalry is actually you. It just is. And so I'm so glad you touched on that. If you want to expand on that at all, I would love for you to do that, how important that emergent leadership is and that cultural competency in those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I'll expand a little bit. I think one of the things that I like about Viequeslove is that it understood its role at the moment. And at the moment, the beginning moment, it was chaos, and you have funds and you throw at it. And we were doing an identification and a prioritization that you mentioned. But then you learn from that and you say, okay, so you probably have some emergent leaders out there, including some very young ones, that you can build capacity and tap into trainings and programs so that you can soften the blow. And so you get used for the new world, which includes these disasters coming more frequent and harder. In our case, we were able to have things that you underestimate, like communications. So the phones that Kelly got, we were using them for obvious coordination reasons. What we didn't know and we saw was that there's a human factor. And this is something that for me, who were being very mission oriented, trying to help, that slipped me. And I learned a lot when they told me, we have Robert Becker, an expert and a political advisor, who said, let's set them up in the plaza and let people talk to their families. This will make for a communal calmness. And they did. And people got 1 or 2 minutes to talk, and they would reach, and we would help them because it's a satellite phone. And they would call, and it would be a progression. You would see the people first like anxious, worried, then the phone would pick up and they would break down. We even had to prep them, like, don't cry, you use your time well, ask them for what you need, let them know you're alive. After that, we took the phone, and when that happened, there was a relaxation. And so they were able to function better. And it's the little things like that you learn to adjust from. We had a hero here, a guy on a Pathfinder with a ham radio, amateur radio. And when nobody could talk to anybody, that one guy would go to the hospital, would go to the police, and he would talk to anything. So we learned from that. And Kelly started a program with Vieques Transforma, a local group here. Now there's 42 radio operators with radios in an emergency net, including boats for fishers, people on cars, resiliency hubs. Vieques did not have a resiliency hub. Now it has 3 to build one building. So part of the real lessons is take the time when there is not a disaster to adjust from the lessons learned, like what we're talking about here now, and to use these resources that are being put out there to be resiliency. And it was certainly a learning experience for us.
Well, I think that a couple of lessons that are so awesome in this is, the first one is that mental health is a huge concern during and after and forever after a disaster. But you can actually build mental health capacity if you think in advance. You know, everyone needs to tell people they're okay. I was in the middle of a 1989 earthquake in San Francisco, and I remember waiting in line at a church, it was all very dramatic, to call my family and tell them that I was okay. And just like once that's done, then you can sort of move on with your day. But first, you have to be able to communicate. And so the second part of the story I also love so much is that one guy was doing a ham radio, which is what, so I'm 51, and I think of people who are in their 70s. You know, I think of like, maybe I think of the 1970s, about using that analog mode of communication. But what an amazing thing to have at your disposal and to build resiliency into your community. It could be a rural community, any community, if they have a ham radio hub. I find that very impressive in your story. And Kelly, can you talk to us about how you took that lesson and just sort of expanded it into more of a mid and long-term resiliency model?
Yeah, I think that as Mark said, the lessons learned during this, you know, for instance, we were talking about that plane that we initially sent down 5 days after the hurricane. Well, it took time to find that plane. It took time to find the pilot, a plane that could carry cargo on one tank of gas, make it to Vieques, be able to refuel in another island and return to Florida. That's the kind of thing is a lesson for me, for us, for everyone, that if you have that information and those resources mapped ahead of time and year round, you're looking at resources and assets and where you are in relation to them, you have a plan, you have more of a safety net. And this communication is one of our proudest accomplishments, to say we will no longer ever be cut off from the rest of the world. We now can communicate with marine radios, ham radios, satellite phones, satellite internet, and we'll no longer ever have the problem that we had before. So we have to look at all of the lessons learned during that time and build that resilience in to mitigate the risk for next time.
And go ahead, Mark, go. Yeah.
One detail that I need to expand, and it's in a lesson for all small rural communities that do not count on the resiliency of communications. You might not realize how the internet really runs everything. So again, good back point. On a small island, no internet, so no banks, no ATM, no pharmacy health plan verification, no supermarket running any type of card, no food stamps cards and all that. Stop it in the middle of a crisis, imagine. So you have all these people who were like, some of them, that's the only income, or that's the only way they buy. You could not take cash out of the bank.
People were literally starving. I mean, they had no way of accessing food at all.
So Generation Gives, which is another nonprofit of ours, and us, we teamed up. He came down, again, another guy who had come to our island. You realize the reasons of one of the travelers that came here. He says, I got an answer. And if you help me, we can make that answer bigger. So we invested in his answer. What was his answer? Portable internet. So he hooked it up to the supermarkets, and it was the first time that one guy from one organization and us, that anybody in Vieques used a credit card or bought food or cashed in their food stamps, not the government, one guy with a briefcase. Then to the banks, they were like, no, for security reasons, we can't do it. So we got the ATM private guy and made another line in the town square where people could access through his little internet, portable internet. And so the pharmacy could not validate people's health plans. So we had to take cash out of our pockets to pay for some people's medicine until suddenly they could put some internet. So you really have to look at your community in terms of what stops running and why, and how do you fix that? And internet is a huge one.
It's a huge one. It's actually something that we invested in last year to have a study done about communication failures and disaster, because so many of the systems that we have come to depend on are completely not in play. Even in a place like Malibu, they lost all ability to communicate in order to keep their first responders safe, and their city manager had to run down to the lifeguard stations because they were the only ones with a landline in order to run the city. And a lot of people who saw like the fire trucks parked on Zuma Beach during the Woolsey fire in 2018 thought that they're like, why didn't you send them up to save my house? And the truth is there was no internet. There was no cellular service. And so there was no way to send first responders up into the canyons of Malibu to save houses. when you couldn't even keep them safe or even let them know which way the wind was blowing. You know, there's a lot of dependency that we have on internet systems. But until we had our disaster, I didn't even know there was portable internet. And so how did, you know, what have you learned since then about portable internet?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we learned is that ironically, banks, supermarkets, ours is a small one, right? And many of these other people do not have that backup systems. Now with satellite internet, then you realize, wow, satellite internet, I do know about. So I just have to set that up. And many people like the resiliency hub said, okay, this is the internet. I put the dish here, hurricane comes, I bring it down. Hurricane goes, I put it back up, pre-arrange the facing, you know, to the satellite, and my solar power, which is a huge lesson we learned, will power it, and then I'll have internet. So we learned. But at the time, again, how many banks in your community, if you're in a rural community, what's the bank's answer to this? What's the supermarket? What's the pharmacy's answer? And in islands, going back to islands, we don't have the luxury of somebody saying, oh, I'm in Texas, I'm going to drive to Louisiana to help them.
Yeah.
On the plus side, you didn't get a lot of used clothes. And so that's something we would like everyone to stop.
Well, we said no. We said no to so many. It was so hard to say no because we had so many organizations reaching out to us saying, can we ship containers of stuff to you? And we learned an important lesson we had an advisor who was telling us about the push-pull and how you can push something onto a community that's not needed, and it can create additional problems, or it's just something they cannot use at the time. So we actually said no to so many people, and it was so hard to do that at the time, but it was probably one of the best things we had ever done. We know that you know, other islands had received ice skates and you know, winter coats and things like that, that they had to sort through and then figure out how to get them to people who can actually use them.
Visit a local manufactured home retailer to get started and ask them about cross-mod homes that qualify for the MH Advantage financing. With customizable layouts and features and surprisingly affordable mortgage financing options, take the first step forward in rebuilding your vibrant community, your town, your paradise with an MH Advantage qualifying home today.
You had asked what we had learned about the internet and all the communication being lost. And one of those lessons is something so basic, but so important in having a plan for next time, of having actual meeting locations established, distribution locations. We resorted to a bullhorn and blackboards around the community to put up information because people were just craving that information. So that is really important to have that kind of plan within your community.
It's been good to see that in every disaster we've seen, CAL FIRE, for example, has dropped off analog forms of communication, which, you know, sandwich boards, even in a place like you know, we are about 10, 15 minutes off the 101 freeway. So we are not as isolated, but even in a place like Sonoma, we still needed to see those, you know, the maps, the updated information. It also, for some people, like, especially if you're a senior, you need a phone call. You're not going to do as well. You're not going to be able to look it up on your, you know, on your phone if your phone is even working. So there's just a lot of different things to consider. One of the things that happens in wildfire, though, that's different from wind and rain is, you know, these houses, they're gone in, they can be under 3 minutes. It can be a football field of destruction every few seconds. Like, that's how hot our mega fires are now. And they are so incredibly destructive. In our case, we lost almost 6,000 units of housing in the first 5 hours. So that is really stunning to think about. However, at the end of it, you know, we only had to house through FEMA about 168 people. And I think they're still puzzling over that. Like, where did people go? But this is a different issue on an island. So can you talk to us about how did you handle like immediate shelter needs? You know, how long did it take for FEMA to get there? What kind of services did you actually get from the federal government?
Well, I think the federal government themselves will even admit that they dropped the ball on this one. And I think it's one of the things that you were saying earlier, Jennifer, that the people in an ethical way have to participate, and the government has to allow that participation to be a more structured, welcoming thing. We did not have people for weeks coming of any federal government. And we thankfully are building mostly out of cement on the island. So our destruction of housing is definitely bad, but it's not something that the houses are completely going like a wildfires, which when you said that the first time we talked, I mean, it, but once you hear it from people who've been there, it stops you, we had to look at it in the way of energy, which we didn't have for a very, very long time. Water, which at one time it was critical, and we were looking at each other like, what do we do now? And so food supplies and such. I mean, those were three things that took away longer when we were talking about colonies and we were talking about underserved. The reality is that the amount of time that Vieques was without power, Puerto Rico for that matter, but Vieques was without power, and the amount of time that it took for help to come. If you were talking in Florida, you'd be talking weeks. We were talking 8 months. And so being here isolated, it brought out something that really strikes people, and that is, if there's not that help coming, then you better act, because what's lost is hope. And it traumatizes people for longer, and it makes them unable to work, unable to deal with it, and then they become, it becomes a little different. So some action sometimes, as long as it's safe and ethical, some action, even if it's not the most effective in the world, does imply that people are like saying, okay, we could do this, even involving those people that normally be traumatized in the help. But we were a case study of how we did not really get a lot of help, then a lot of lobbying and advocacy, honestly speaking. We have people like that have a love for the islands, politicians, congresspersons, and other people that came up and said, hey, you know what about Vieques? You have Lydia Velasquez, you have George Pataki, you got other people that either lived here or have a house here, and made an effort and said, no, you pay attention to them. And you look at that, and that doesn't seem like part of the plan, and it shouldn't be, because it obviously has a sort of discriminative power, who happens to live there. If you have a millionaire or a billionaire or a politician, then you get better treatment. It should not be that way. But it is important that you know who your voice is out that can advocate for you. And if not, you have to create spaces for advocates to go, like we did with the Hispanic Federation and people who...
Actually, I want you to stay in this for just a minute, because I know that we have been viewed with suspicion and even derision, and even been like maligned, because we prioritized advocacy from the beginning. And we knew that we didn't know much, but we did know that there are a lot of disasters now in the United States. We had 22 disasters that cost $1 billion or over just in 2020, and that does not count COVID. These are climate change disasters. So people don't necessarily understand that you have to advocate for your community. Because if you don't, you get lost. And it's not because it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they don't care. It's not because, USDA doesn't want to help you. It's because you have to actually, rise to the moment and say, wait, look at us. And one of the things at Rebuild North Bay that we believe that there are many opportunities to build what we call regional equity into disaster, to level it so that it isn't the case that you have to be a more well-resourced community to get what you need, because it's so frustrating to us that you have to hire a giant accounting firm. What if you can't afford a lobbyist? 2 out of the 4 counties that we represent, they don't have federal lobbyists because they can't afford them. But what you have, where you were, is that you had some politicians with an emotional connection, and it shouldn't be based upon luck. But regardless, I do want you to tell our audience, though, your story of advocacy and any advice that you can give them, especially if they're a community that may not have that direct emotional relationship with people in positions of power.
Well, I think of several things. One is identify people who represent you, and then try to put this in their agenda. I think nobody can tell me that they were ready. No politician, no emergency person, not the government, nobody, FEMA, nobody was ready for this, although climate change was leaning towards this a long time. FEMA blatantly said, hey, we had 5 disasters at the same time. We weren't built for that. We can't do it. So then we have to adjust, right? And so advocacy shows a couple of things. One is we're here, we're alive, this is going on. Because when I went to Washington, D.C. to advocate, or when I was talking to some people, they were completely confused about where we were. Forget about what we were or what we needed. They were like, oh, you're taken care of by these people. No, we're not. Oh, really? You know, so they don't know. Advocacy is necessary because sometimes it's not the job of senators or many other people to be handling operations. You know, they bring policy, and that policy doesn't work anymore. And we have to advocate to find the answer, and an ethical, just, equitative answer for the fact that the emergency system and even the funding for it does not work. So it'd be in their economic interest, in their resiliency and life-saving, to restructure it to the what we're living today. We had some people that traveled here who love Vieques. We have some people who are politicians or ex-politicians who could make a phone call. But one of the best ways that I would like to see it happen, and it's equitative, is to identify the leaders in the community. And these are sometimes 14-year-olds. And go up from there to say they can represent us, they can capture the audience. And again, one of the things that I learned the most that makes me like a desperate person now is that while there's not a disaster, is when you have to work. When you're in disaster, you get more attention, and obviously more funding, more attention, more government action. But the work should be done before the disaster, or we'll do the same mistake again.
Totally see that's true, but you also had the extra added bonus of becoming a political football, and not in a good way. And just yesterday, the Biden administration released the allocated funds, because what a lot of people don't understand before you go through a disaster, it's not like you have the disaster and then all of the government funding just rolls in. And so when you see, you know, a certain amount allocated to an area, it could still take 2, 3, 4 years to get there. And just yesterday, the Biden administration actually released.
They just closed the Sandy disaster like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. You know, so it gives you an idea how long it could take. One of the things that I think is another lesson to learn is that communities need convening organizations that can work between the government and the NGOs and the community and the local governments and the federal government. That is very necessary, and it goes from the operations of coordination of resources, funding, grants, capacity building, etc., to the advocacy. The Hispanic Federation, apart from dealing with funding a lot of recovery programs and a lot of donations that they did, and hosting a lot of think tanks and webinars, etc., to build capacity, they created a space for a voice in Washington, D.C., in what they call the Day of Action, where they paid for leaders from all over Puerto Rico, including myself, to go to Capitol Hill and say, hey, we think you should do something about the way this recovery funding is going, about the restructuring of how FEMA works. And they allowed us to say whatever we wanted, but they put us in front of Congress and Senate to try to bring that, and they constantly advocate for that. So that's a good example of a foundation that's basically saying advocacy is for sure incredibly important, because if you don't change a policy that doesn't work and a funding structure that doesn't work, where you're going to wind up. So they continue to do that, and I think that many platforms, that one, the RISE platform is a very interesting one, which is based out of the SUNY and CUNY systems in New York with agencies and Puerto Rico, which is like, how can academia help restructure the disaster and the diaspora movement? How can we make it more efficient using our intellectual capacity? So there are some foundations and some entities out there who are saying, no, listen, this just doesn't work. So we have to advocate and we have to strategize.
And I also noticed that you guys worked with Tesla. Can you talk to us about that? Because we believe that big tech has a big place in improving disaster, but can you talk to us about your work with Tesla?
Sure. Viequeslove and Kelly, specifically, when Tesla comes to Puerto Rico, and I don't work, or we don't work, or for Tesla, and we think all renewable energy should be pursued, the solar especially. So all companies are well good. But when Tesla showed up, when not a lot of people had showed up and said, we have a humanitarian, and we want to help water, we want to help communications, and we want to help health. And we'll do some private things. So they came here and put solar arrays and power packs in the health center, in the water pumping station, and in a couple of other places. And then they said, we'll also help individual people who are in, renal patients, diabetics, asthmatics, and we'll set up, a few houses with power walls, which is their different technology. And then they kept on working, kept on talking, and then they said, you know what? And one of them flew in and said, we think we can make the island solar. And we were like, what? And so they came and they spent a lot of their money trying to see how they could make it a solar island. And eventually, I think Tesla was working at a very fast speed that the Puerto Rican government was still reeling. And so locally, they said, sure, go ahead. If you can make our island solar, absolutely. And then they did the engineering and such. When it goes to the main island of Puerto Rico, it didn't work out business-wise. I'm not privy to that information. I don't know why. But what it did show was that fast action from companies, if it's ethical, saves lives. And that there's a social responsibility attached to this, and a prototypes that they could now deploy package systems in health, water, and communications. And we need to reach out to them or other people that can do that for rural communities that have no other answer, right? The other thing that it showed is it can be done. So by that push of having a solar array and kind of like a microgrid for the whole island, different federal funding and different so that was, I take my heart off to Tesla because they were there, and I know they're controversial in many ways, but I was there when they were doing the work, and again, they asked it faster than many other people. The other people that I gotta say, and I'll take my whole head out to them, was the United States Coast Guard. When nobody came here, the first boat that came here was United States Coast Guard, and they came to the shoreline and basically said, take me to your leader. And we did. And it went from then that they came back 5 times and brought water, diesel, food, and communications and hope on a boat. I tell you, we had 2 operations guys for Viequeslove volunteers, Alexis Pimentel and Frank Sanchez, and through their connection and the Coast Guard, they were lifesavers, and they were definitely a show of force.
That is, there's so many things to touch upon in your story. One of the things that I really love is that how often you bring up the term hope. And often we say that our organization we mitigate pain, and we try to give hope to new communities and say, look, this really terrible thing happened, but you can get through it. And here are some tools you can adapt that will work. It will depend on emergent leaders, and it does actually depend upon the government has a role to play, and these convening organizations like yours and like mine have a very important role to play. And then there's this other space in between where the private sector can also make a huge difference. And I love the fact that, we don't think of Tesla or any other, it doesn't matter about Tesla so much. We don't care if they're controversial. But, you can have any corporation can go in, and as long as they are not trying to really profit off of your misery, which is disaster capitalism, if they're honestly just seeing like, how can we make a difference? We believe at our organization that the private sector has a huge role to play because they also have fast money. They have fast money can make really a significant humanitarian difference and to bring hope and relief to people when they're at their most vulnerable. And it's really like a call out to any corporation that has something to give, even if it's that they can fund, the dollars to bring the systems in, if they can fund, whatever the ecosystem of care that was created on, or the models from certain places can be adapted to other places. It may be that they fly, you and Kelly into another island community or rural community and say, here are some things that really worked for us. And we know that FEMA is getting more and more clear as the years go on that they actually can't go at this alone, that they do need you, and they do need me, and they do need Rebuild Paradise, and they're super vocal and appreciative about that. But to invite the private sector in is not the same as inviting them in to profit off of your misery, but in fact, they have a role to play.
Yeah, and I'm gonna leave the hope thing for Kelly here because she again, I missed it, and it was a learning experience for me by ignoring it at first, and it changed my life the way I had to learn it. But I want to say two things that you said there. One, the Clinton Global Initiative, for example, has been a very good example of how to merge these people into agreements so that private sector can ethically participate with government and with their local organizations to empower them, not to tell them what to do, to empower them so that they can do the thing. But one thing that sounds strange, but people have to realize about organizations like yours and ours and some of the other ones is that they are successful because they are flexible and agile. And resiliency has a lot of redundancy, but it doesn't cover everything. No model, no preparations. It prepares you for the flexibility of having the funds or the flexibility that the government may not have to say, I'm suddenly going to deal with a pharmacy. That's done. I'm going to turn around and deal with a doc. And it needs money and it needs attention, and I can do that now without the bureaucracy. And that flexibility and that agileness is why these type of organizations are going to be needed from now on, no matter what you build as capacity, because it's an unknown world. But in terms of hope, I think that is one of the things that Kelly and everybody else in Viequeslove did a lot better than me. I was sort of being based and I apologize to all the people I mistreated along the way.
Well, Mark says that only because he was essentially running a military, almost a military bait kind of phased operation on the ground. He was handling so much while we were providing the support from the states, but he provided hope to people by empowering people. And one of the things that what he mentioned earlier, that working year round when there's not a disaster on the way, when we're working outside of the disaster, the important thing is to build that plan for people to be empowered to help and to have a role in the disaster. And that's part of our initiative, and also the initiative at the Vieques Conservation and Historical Trust is to train people for CERT training for community emergency response teams, and to get that training and that empowerment in place before the next disaster. So that gives people hope to know that there's a plan, to know that there are other people they can count on during that time, and that leads to sustainability too, and mitigating risk.
And I think we can all evolve to what's happening, and if they're better prepared, you're a lot less worried. I mean, we are better at handling COVID and the pandemic in Vieques because our experience from Maria. That's a fact.
I just want to give an amen to that. Oh my goodness. Yes. And it speaks to I think so much of that is about the flexibility that you had to earn during the disaster that, when COVID descended, we were able to immediately pivot to just focus on that for months. We focused on that solely for about 4 or 5 months, grant making, a lot of convening, and a lot of teaching other organizations like how to pivot themselves and to make sure that they had the support and to see see ourselves as a network as opposed to individual actors in a relief place. But how did you respond? I love that you talk about flexibility, how important that is, but how did you respond to COVID on the island? It must be great to be an island in the middle of COVID.
In some ways, but we don't have a hospital here. So, we had to look at in the same thing as looking at a disaster like a hurricane, you're looking at the risk to lives, and you're looking at what could possibly happen and the obstacles to that, and putting solutions in place before it happens. So we don't have a hospital here. Any COVID positive patient has to be transported off the island, either by boat or plane, in an isolation chamber, which we did not have. So that became part of a plan that our COO, Jorge Fernandez Porto, wrote a proposal for a grant from the Hispanic Federation. And we started with a grant from them to develop this contact tracing team, and put that in place way back in March. Before we even had one case here, we started an education campaign for the community and contact tracing training. So everyone was ready for that risk. And then he wrote the proposal for the municipality to receive the CARES Act funding. So it was adding to that initiative. It was just growing, but we had that strong team. But looking at those risks ahead of time, just with any kind of disaster, you have to put the solutions in place before it actually happens.
You know, you have to, but we're human, and until it's actually happened, you know, even in places like I'm in California, so we think, oh, earthquake, I've done that. You know, I've been through a lot of earthquakes. You know, I've been through big ones and small ones. And so that's what we always thought about. We never really anticipated, because we were the first huge, big, ugly, nasty, awful mega fire. And now, of course, Paradise and Woolsey fire and so many things have happened since. So it was almost that, you know, our emergency managers were off in Yosemite together. They weren't even here. They were like, you know, at a conference. I mean, it never occurred to them to leave one at home. So they don't work there anymore. But it's, you know, I think that people, because of COVID, are going to be more interested and more willing to think about, you know, climate change, climate disasters, and you see them on TV. But until you undergo it.
I almost disagree with that statement. That
go ahead, tell me what I'm wrong. I mean, that's good.
I think that people don't realize until they go through something like that. They don't realize, they have no idea what it would be like to live through a wildfire, or to live without power for 5 months or 7 months. You know, it's just, you can't even fathom it because you're so used to the conveniences of life that I don't know how it's going to sink in. I really don't.
Oh, just so you know, we actually agree. So if I wasn't clear, I just, that's the hard, I'm saying that's one of the hard things about building in preparedness, is that you can't fathom that you could, you know, walk out into where, I remember this one point when I was evacuating the whole town of Sonoma, and we were going out to Sears Point, and we'd been in it at this point for about 4 days, and we were surrounded by wildfires that were merging and growing and destroying, and we couldn't breathe, and we had been doing services for days. And I was with my dogs in the car, and I'd sent my husband and my stepson off already. And I thought, wow, everything that I've ever known, like, in my whole life is gonna go. Like, that's probably the reality of it. And every, like, where it sounds really hokey, but like where I had my first kiss, or where I had a bad date, or, you know, like all of those touch points of your life, those visual ones, I was letting go as I was sitting in this long line. And it was, you know, I just cried my eyes out. So so it was it was kind of a terrible moment. But until you've lived through that awful made-for-TV movie, I never watched disaster movies.
I think that you're both right, and although you think you disagree, I think people not only need to learn their lessons, even the people that went through it have a short memory. And the reason that I say that is because we're used to it being on or off. When that power came back on for the first time, people were like different. They were like, oh my God, and they're hugging and they're saving it, and they're like, I'm gonna get solar and I'm gonna be more this. And as time goes by, they start forgetting, because they get compliance, which is what got us into being so unready in the beginning. And I think that it's a stoppage that we have to do. I don't know what needs to be said, because one of the things that all these disasters that we're talking about of the wildfires and the hurricanes and the earthquakes and all that. What you're talking climate change. And you're talking a climate change that we created or contributed to, and you need to address that. And so we have to change our complete lifestyles, or if not, then what have we really learned? And it's a question of investing in the future of the world rather than just saying, oh, well, next year climate change still going to be like this, you know. But could you imagine, you know, the amount of hurricanes we had this year? We didn't get one in Vieques, but, you know, the most. And then so you're talking now it's going to get to an area of 20 superstorms a year. You want to get to that? No, you still have time. So we have to make some radical changes, some radical policy decisions, that were advocacy coming back to it, because people have to understand that we made a humongous mistakes in the way we live. And there are other answers and there are other ways, and we can do that. In the smaller scope of it, when we were talking about lessons learned, I wanted to go back and after that long speech, go to some details that I think could help the audience a little bit. Is that there's a couple of things that you have to do in rural areas, and that's key persons. There are key persons that you cannot replace. And so even if all in COVID or in hurricanes, if we, for some reason, hope not, lose the ability to have our emergency management people, our paramedics, our EMTs, our police, our firefighters, and all that, they are not replaceable because the area is so rural, we don't even have street names. So you couldn't work really. So you have to identify all those key people, and believe it or not, you have to baby them. You know, you have to take care of them really well, and you got to give them the PPEs and the tools and the protection that they need, because you cannot replace them. That's something that we see, but people who are not been through disasters maybe think, oh, well, he's always there, or there's the police, or there's a firefighter. Yeah, but what if, you know, those persons are not really replaceable in urban situations?
So I think what I hear you saying is that, you know, you increase your vulnerability through complacency, and increase your resiliency through innovation. And
that's better than I could ever put it.
Oh, well, you know, but that's what I'm hearing though. And I think that that's what our audience will be hearing too. And I think that that's a really important lesson, because it really, it's, you know, it can be a little, it's a little scary, or you just think, oh, somebody knows more than I do. But if you have a good idea, even if you just contribute to a corner of that resiliency, then you've still done what a local supervisor here, James Gore, always calls relentless, imperfect progress. Always.
Yeah, and Jennifer, you said something about that little corner. This is very important. And in a world of think tanks and a world of people working and collaborating, we run into a lot of philosophical discussions in disasters are not super convenient. They're good now. Change the policy now. But don't sit there while the ship goes down figuring out where's the manual and what's the best to plug the holes. You know, you gotta act. So many of the things that we did was act and adjust. Act and empower, act and build capacity, but you have to act safely and ethically and with compliance to the laws and regulations. But that's what organizations like us can do, and government or private sector can't really do, because you can't trust the private sector alone, and you can't count on the government because they don't have the resources, or they have to go to certain bureaucracy to do it, orders and such. So we plug the hole and then say, how do I make it not be a hole again?
Exactly.
Oh my God. Amen to all of that. Seriously. And I think that how you keep bringing up ethics is really important, because I know that for so much of the service that we've done, that I've done, and that I did during the fires, it wasn't really hard to make decisions, because you just knew if you're ethical, you know the right thing to do. You know, like the priority, it will come somewhat naturally in that sense. It doesn't, and the unpredictable part of it, because what you are is that you get into the flow of making sure you're always helping your community get to that next stage, or the matters of life and death, making sure that, like in our case, the elderly did not sleep on the floor of the gym, because that's not okay. You know, so what can we do right then? But it's always act and adjust, act and adjust. I'm totally going to steal that. I want to actually sort of finish out by asking you each to relay a story. And I don't know what that story is. I've not asked you in advance, but there is a book by Rebecca Solnit, and it's called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's about, she did all this research about what happens in disaster, because often, all that we learn is dystopian. Oh God, you have a disaster, and then everyone like jumps out and gets out their guns and they just shoot each other, and then they take their hoard of food. But the reality is that in most cases, I'm not sure about COVID. We're a little bit weird in America, it's all a little weird right now, but generally speaking, you have a disaster and the community will not turn away, they will turn towards each other. So my question for each of you is, if you could relay for us one story where you knew that you were meeting humanity at its finest in a most unexpected time. And I'll start with Kelly.
Oh, wow. Do you have to start with me?
Yes.
I don't, but I can't.
That is a really tough one. That's a very hard question. I'd have to think about that for a moment. But I will say that one thing that really struck me, it's more of a collection of stories that came out to kind of a life lesson of just being able to be on a phone call with, politicians or owners of solar companies, and in a room full of people that were experts, but being able to trust instincts and having guts to trust those instincts to say, no, I don't think that's right for this community, was a turning point for me in this whole endeavor of starting Viequeslove and continuing Viequeslove, because I really wasn't sure of how to continue it after the disaster or even during. But having the guts to know what was right for your own community, having the local knowledge to be able to say, I disagree with all of you and this is why, that was a real turning point for me for Vieques and for Viequeslove, because I recognize that I rely on a network of people that really know and love Vieques, and that is the team. That's our stronghold, and that's how we know our decisions are going to be made correctly, because we're not making it for us. We're not even making those decisions for Viequeslove. We're making the decisions for Vieques. That's not really answering your question, but
actually, it speaks to what I said before, and so I love that too. So I'll take it.
So
okay.
my story, in reality, of what the humanity of it, I already told you, which was the satellite phones. When I saw the people, it's the one that whenever I remember my eyes water, I tense up, and it did at the time when nothing was touching me, because I've forgotten certain humanity. But that was the one that when I saw everybody sort of react the same way, and then I saw the peace they got at the end, that was definitely something incredible. The stories of the resiliency hubs like Freque Transforma and Vieques Conservation Trust and all the people who took this and said, you know what, we're going to be stronger, reminded me of what my grandmother told me. My grandmother turns 104 in 2 weeks. And she told me after Maria, and she saw us in the news. I want to say, by the way, David Benoit saved lives in Puerto Rico and in Vieques with his reporting. And that was also humanity, because it gave a little bit more strength to reporting. And I owe him big time, because he was great for that. But my grandmother, after she saw me in the David Benoit interview, she was like, you were good, and that was great. But I don't know what's wrong with you people. I lived through a lot, and we got out and we cleaned the place, and we got whoever needed food, and we got whoever needed water, and we hunkered down and we put on candles and we talked and we read and we kept on living. And so it was very interesting to me. This lady who had been 104 years, think about all the disasters and all the things that she's learned, that she was saying, hey, don't forget, you're humans, you can do this. And that was another human factor when we were all like dealing with all the pumped up thing and with all the, we should do this. And it's like, hey, you got this. You got this. We always have this.
Oh, I'm going to end it there because I couldn't make it any more perfect than that. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you. It's such a pleasure to have to be getting to know you and the work that I'm looking forward to doing with you. And I really want to thank Don Russell from FEMA for connecting us. So in case he ever listens to this, I really enjoy him. I just want to
Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. This is really powerful lessons learned, as we say.
Yeah, and the world learns through stories, and you're telling stories, Jennifer. So thank you, because I think that when you look at reports and when you look at the breakdown, they don't carry the same power of this that you're doing in this series. So thank you for doing it, and also bringing us together, so we realize that it's a world thing. You know, it's not just a hurricane, it's not just a fire, it's a world thing.
We will do better together. That I'm never in doubt of. And thank you again so much. Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us. And we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.